On the 5th day of January 1942, Tokyo's streets reverberated with victory chants, while inside the combined fleet, a single voice asked for caution. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of Japan's main striking arm, told his chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, to begin drafting the second phase of operations. The first had worked beyond expectation. Malaya, Hong Kong, the Philippines, the East Indies, all falling like dominoes. Yet Yamamoto's mood was not triumphal. He had lived in America, knew its factories, its tool dyes, its river of oil, and he understood what those assets meant when war stretched beyond a season.
He had warned old friends, even before Pearl Harbor, that Japan, if it chose war, must win fast or not at all. For 6 months, he said, he could run wild. After that, he guaranteed nothing. Now, 1 month into the war, the running looked effortless. British prestige shattered in Asia. American battleships twisted in the sludge of Pearl Harbor. Dutch oil fields coming under the rising sun. In the corridors of power, the nationalist officers wanted more. Australia, India, a march across the Indian Ocean to join the Germans. The louder the crowd celebrated, the more Yamamoto's doubts grew.
His opposition to unlimited war was no secret. Friends had warned him that remaining in Tokyo invited assassination. The right wing saw any talk of limits as betrayal. Ugaki recorded the Admiral's refrain, far-sighted statesmanship, victory turned toward peace before the enemy's industry awoke. The phrase sounded heretical in that winter of Japanese ascendancy, but Yamamoto's perspective came from numbers as much as from intuition. America's carriers had escaped at Pearl Harbor. The United States possessed shipyards that could raise a fleet as if planting a forest. A strategy built entirely on momentum would, in time, encounter friction. To the public, the empire seemed unassailable. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk off Malaya. Manila was lost. Hong Kong surrendered. Newspaper headlines exuded inevitability. Inside the Navy Ministry, however, the arguments were brutal. The Army wanted to punch toward the Soviet Union or plunge into India. Yamamoto favored an Indian Ocean offensive to smash Britain's Far Eastern fleet, secure the sea lanes, and harvest oil enough to fuel an empire. The Army refused to be led by naval logic. With that avenue closed, Yamamoto turned east in thought. The unstruck nerve at Pearl Harbor was not a row of battleships. It was the American carrier force. Only a spectacular blow against those carriers could convulse Washington into negotiation.
Even in victory, reality intruded. On April 18, 1942, the Doolittle Raiders flew from a carrier deck and dropped their bombs on Tokyo. Damage on the ground was modest. Damage to confidence was not. The unthinkable had happened. American aircraft over the home islands. If the regime wanted reassurance, Yamamoto would supply it with a decisive victory. He sketched a plan to draw the U.S. carriers into a killing ground near a small atoll named Midway. Once the carriers were sunk and the Pacific stripped of American air power, diplomacy could be framed from strength.
The plan overlooked one quiet fact. American cryptanalysts were reading the Japanese naval code. While the combined fleet polished formations and timing, Chester Nimitz positioned his few carriers exactly where Yamamoto intended to find them, and then to be found himself. On June 4, 1942, 4 of Japan's irreplaceable fleet carriers were struck in cascading explosions that destroyed aircraft, crews, and the elite culture of a naval air arm built across a decade. By sunset, the bill came due for a string of flawless victories. The loss of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu could be concealed from the public. It could not be concealed from the future. The plan overlooked one quiet fact. American cryptanalysts were reading the Japanese naval code. While the combined fleet polished formations and timing, Chester Nimitz positioned his few carriers exactly where Yamamoto intended to find them, and then to be found himself. On June 4, 1942, 4 of Japan's irreplaceable fleet carriers were struck in cascading explosions that destroyed aircraft, crews, and the elite culture of a naval air arm built across a decade. By sunset, the bill came due for a string of flawless victories. The loss of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu could be concealed from the public. It could not be concealed from the future. On the Allied side, doctrines collided. General Douglas MacArthur, newly established in Australia, urged an army-led drive up through New Guinea. Admiral Ernest King, the hard-edged chief of naval operations, saw the counteroffensive as a naval prerogative. If American pride had been wounded at Pearl Harbor, American ships and aviators would be the instruments of redress. King pushed for a strike that cut across MacArthur's geometry, seize an unfinished Japanese airfield on a jungle-covered island most Americans could not pronounce, Guadalcanal, and build a foothold before Tokyo understood it had been challenged. The plan received the codename Watchtower. It was as ambitious as it was rushed. Amphibious assaults are exacting operations. The Navy had not executed one under fire in living memory. The 1st Marine Division trained hard, learned theory, then boarded transports with a thin cushion of practice. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley was given regional command. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner would choreograph the landing. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would protect the force with carriers. Major General Alexander Vandegrift would lead the Marines ashore. Their coordination would be improvised at sea, under pressure, within weeks.
The plan received the code name Watchtower. It was as ambitious as it was rushed. Amphibious assaults are exacting operations. The Navy had not executed one under fire in living memory. The 1st Marine Division trained hard, learned theory, then boarded transports with a thin cushion of practice. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley was given regional command. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner would choreograph the landing. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would protect the force with carriers. Major General Alexander Vandegrift would lead the Marines ashore. Their coordination would be improvised at sea, under pressure, within weeks. The rehearsal on Coral Island in Fiji did not inspire confidence. Landing craft strayed, schedules slipped, supplies came ashore in the wrong order. Vandegrift called it a complete bust. There was no time to fix everything. War rarely grants rehearsal and then indulgence. By late July 1942, tens of thousands of Marines, sailors, and airmen were staging across the South Pacific. For the Watchtower assault itself, roughly 19,000 Marines would go ashore, while thousands of sailors crewed the 75 ships that carried them. Japan did not sleep. From Rabaul, reconnaissance aircraft probed the sea lanes. Pilots believed the American carriers had been wrecked at Midway. They would soon learn otherwise. On the morning of August 7th, the sky cleared as if for a ceremony. The carriers launched. The first strikes hammered outposts at Tulagi and Gavutu Tanambogo, destroying floatplanes at anchor and torching fuel stores. Surprise manifested in small details. A breakfast table laid with rice and plums. Chopsticks abandoned in a hurry. Tents punctured by shrapnel and collapsed by naval shells. On Guadalcanal's north shore, near Lunga Point, the Marines landed through surf that slapped against the bows of Higgins boats. The surf slapped the ramp doors. When they dropped, the jungle exhaled heat like a furnace. They found empty camps and an airfield site half carved from the earth. The Japanese construction units had fled inland. Tulagi told a different story. The Marine raiders under Merritt Edson met dug-in resistance. The terrain twisted into ravines and knife-backed ridges. Caves transformed into machine gun apertures that interlocked and then overlapped. The raiders learned to crawl up cliff faces and drop explosives into throats of rock. They learned that what seemed dead often was not. A dugout silenced by a satchel charge still hid a pistol or a grenade. They learned quickly that surrender would be rare. That night, a desperate counterattack slashed into the Marine perimeter, reached within a stone's throw of Edson's command post, and left behind a brutal ratio of wounded to dead. By the end of the second day, Tulagi's defenders were gone, almost to the last man.
Overhead, the first air battles of the campaign taught both sides something sharp. Twin-engine Betty bombers, escorted by Zeros, streaked from Rabaul, met American Wildcats over the beaches, and disintegrated in the combined fire of fighters and shipboard guns. Against Zeros, however, the American pilots learned to fly in pairs, to scissor into one another's arcs and rely on the Wildcat's rugged frame to soak rounds a Zero could not survive. Japanese aces, including Saburo Sakai, carved their lessons into the sky and still returned to Rabaul with holes in wings and blood in cockpits. It became clear that the issue was not just skill, but distance. The Japanese faced a 1,000-mile round trip. Every loss on that route drained experience that could not be readily replaced. While the Marines pushed inland to seize the airfield they would later name Henderson, Admiral Fletcher signaled that he would not keep his carriers close indefinitely. His losses on the first days, though not crippling, convinced him that the carriers must be preserved. When he withdrew earlier than Turner and Vandegrift expected, the amphibious force realized it would face increasing Japanese air pressure without the umbrella that had opened the battle. Turner redoubled the unloading effort, piling ammunition, rations, and fuel onto beaches that looked like warehouses exposed to the sun. Vandegrift worried that too much was ashore in the wrong order and that not enough men stood between the beach and the jungle. Japan reacted with speed where it could. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa at Rabaul gathered a squadron of heavy cruisers and destroyers and sprinted south through a narrow sea lane the Americans would soon call the Slot. Night favored the Japanese. Their training in night fighting was deep, their torpedoes infamous, their doctrine crafted precisely for such a stroke. American reconnaissance had holes. Misrouted requests and lost messages left the most obvious enemy approach partially unsearched. Submarines saw hints. B-17s glimpsed columns, but the mosaic never clicked into a single alarming picture. As dusk fell on August 8th, the Marines believed the worst of the opening might be behind them. On Tulagi and Gavutu Tanambago, the last pockets were being cleared, though snipers still cracked now and then from palms and rafters. On Guadalcanal, Marines reached the edges of the half-built runway and ran hands over graded dirt, already imagining aircraft of their own lifting from it. The sea looked crowded with promise. Transports, destroyers, a lattice of wakes. Somewhere beyond the silhouettes, Japanese cruisers were knifing south beneath a sky that hid them and a doctrine that sharpened them. The Marines on the beach could not know it, but the next hours would test the fragility of their foothold and the consequences of fighting an enemy who lived by night. They slept in shallow holes, boots still on, rifles leaning against packs. Jungle insects hummed a faint wire song. Offshore, American ships shifted stations and posted lookouts. The ocean itself seemed to draw breath.
Dawn on the 7th had been theirs. Dusk on the 8th belonged to the enemy.
Mikawa's cruisers advanced in darkness, with engines throttled to a pace that matched his timing to the minute. He did not have carriers. He did not need them. His plan relied on the Americans' inexperience with night battle, on the geography of islands that made a funnel of water, and on a torpedo that would earn a name whispered with respect and fear: the Long Lance. American air searches that might have warned the beachhead were incomplete. Patrol arcs left the slot partly uncovered after a signal dissolved in transmission. Submarines reported movement from St. George's Channel. A flight crew saw cruisers on a vector toward Rabaul and assumed routine traffic. Turner understood the vulnerability in principle. He asked for the obvious gap to be covered. War punishes small errors as if they were grave sins. On that night, errors aligned. In the afternoon, Marines on Guadalcanal had reached the runway and the nearby ridgelines. They found grading equipment, fuel dumps, and rough barracks. They also found signs of haste and panic, tools scattered, food half-eaten, lists nailed to posts with names of construction units who had expected to sleep there. The Marines began to understand that the first day's ease did not prove the island was soft. It proved the Japanese had been surprised. Surprise is not character. It is timing. Character would return soon enough. Across Sealark Channel, Tulagi told the price of contact. The raider experience had turned into a primer of island combat. Snipers used height. Machine guns used geometry. The Japanese fought from caves with overlapping arcs and a refusal to yield. The raiders learned to cut in from above, to toss explosives down into dark mouths of stone, to wait for the riposte that often came just when you thought the dugout pacified. They learned that offering surrender might yield a grenade. They learned to end fights quickly. At sea, Fletcher had withdrawn his carriers, a decision controversial then and debated ever since. To him, it was prudence in a theater where carriers were few and distances immense. To Turner and Vandegrift, it felt like a curtain pulled away as the actors remained on stage. The immediate consequence was practical. Every hour that cargo lingered ashore was an hour when Japanese aircraft might find it without fear of American fighters overhead. Turner drove his transports hard, but logistics has its own tempo. Cargo came off in the order it had been packed, which was not always the order combat demanded. By the evening of the 8th, Coast Watchers signaled incoming air raids. American fighters splashed bombers over the channel, raking twin-engine silhouettes as they droned into flak. Ships took hits, transports burned, damage parties fought fires with hoses and curses. The pattern repeated. Beatty formations lost heavily against alert defenses. Zeros dueled wildcats and taught lessons they would teach once more the next day. The balance was not static, however. Japanese pilots faced the tyranny of range. Their fatigue arrived with them. American pilots cycled from carriers when carriers were present. When they were gone, ship guns bore the load. The duel overhead foreshadowed the campaign's future. Whoever owned the airfield at Lunga would gain a short ladder to the sky. Night hid the Japanese cruisers as they wove past the western end of Savo Island. Lookouts on American ships searched for shadows darker than the dark. Radar on a few vessels offered a technical edge not all captains trusted. Training at night was thin, doctrine newer than many officers' habits. When Mikawa's formation burst into gunfire, it felt less like the start of battle than the eruption of some maritime ambush centuries older than radar. The Japanese salvoed long lances in spreads that ran gleaming beneath the water like wolves. Shells walked across decks. Searchlights carved white columns through smoke. Ships died quickly and then burned slowly. In the chaos that would be named the Battle of Savo Island, 4 Allied cruisers, HMAS Condra, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and USS Vincennes went down, with USS Chicago badly damaged. Surviving ships withdrew, shocked and scattered, and the gap they left around the transports was not academic, it was opportunity. Mikawa, for his part, faced a choice: drive on and savage the transports, or break contact and preserve his strength before daylight brought American planes. He chose prudence. His withdrawal spared the beachhead a catastrophe that could have unstitched the entire operation. Fortune, caution, and the clock combined to grant the Marines a reprieve. Sometimes, survival is not heroism, but arithmetic running in your favor for an hour. When morning came, the Marines saw smoke on the horizon and heard rumors. They also saw that their supplies had to move off beaches faster than human hands alone could carry them. They turned to the airfield. Bulldozers roared. Marines with entrenching tools did the work of a month in days. The Strip would become Henderson Field, named for a flyer killed at Midway. It would become a place where the balance of air could pivot every afternoon. The Japanese understood the same equation. From Rabaul, flights came daily to bomb the runway, to crater dirt, to burn fuel, to kill in patterns that had a schedule. For weeks, the island's afternoon became a ritual: the distant growl, the scramble, the intercept, the impact, the tally. The Marines called the gauntlet the Cactus Air Force once the first American fighters and dive bombers began to stage through the new field. The name was sardonic and proud. It was also a statement of fact. The air group was prickly and resilient, and rooted in hostile ground.
On Tulagi, mopping up continued with a psychological adjustment. Marines did not expect surrender. In dugouts where officers were cornered, shots rang out and 3 bodies dropped, the last cartridges spent on themselves, not on the enemy. It made no sense to the Americans, except as doctrine of a different civilization. After a few feigned surrenders ended in sudden knifings or grenade blasts, Marines stopped accepting theatrics as mercy. The campaign taught its own law: control the cave, count the bodies twice, assume nothing that moves is harmless until it is still, and then still again. The first days, landings, counterattacks, the night disaster off Savo scraped away the illusion that this would be another sweep like the early Allied retreats. Attrition as a system replaced maneuver as an event. Every Japanese convoy that tried to reinforce Guadalcanal, every American supply run that braved the straits, fed a calculus in which the island measured who wanted the future more. The Japanese began their reinforcement through fast destroyer runs the Americans called the Tokyo Express. These runs delivered men, but little heavy equipment. The Americans brought tonnage, wire, fuel, and despairs that keep aircraft flying. The mismatch would widen as Henderson became more than a scraped strip of earth. Yamamoto had said Japan needed swift victory followed by political settlement. Instead, Japan now faced a slow campaign that bled trained pilots, sank ships built with exacting art, and consumed energy measured in distances no map could soften. What Midway had broken in a week, Guadalcanal would grind for months. Men on both sides felt the change not as a thesis, but as fatigue. Pilots flew into weather that felt like wet rope, fought, landed on fuel that sloshed in drums, slept little, and did it again. Marines ate rations that tasted of tin and killed mosquitoes for sport because they could not kill the jungle. Japanese soldiers marched and starved and dug in and charged because orders and honor and habit fused into one impulse that did not ask how many ships had sunk in a far bay. When the first American fighters rose from Henderson's rough surface and met incoming bombers at altitude, something changed beyond the tactical.
The Marines looked up and saw their own aircraft over their own runway on an island that had been an enemy's project a week before. That sight rewired morale. On the Japanese side, bomber crews saw interceptors requiring no 1,000-mile round trip, no delicate fuel gamble. The Pacific had shrunk to a radius of a few minutes. The Empire's map, which had stretched confidently across oceans, now bent around a single strip of earth scraped from jungle by men with dozers and shovels. At sea, the Allies absorbed the lesson Savo had written in fire by altering screens, tightening night procedures, and extending reconnaissance. The next time a Japanese cruiser force threaded the slot, it would meet a different reception. Not perfect, not foolproof, just different enough to shift probabilities. The campaign's dynamic, daylight American advantage strengthened by Henderson, nocturnal Japanese advantage pressed by doctrine and torpedo, would persist for months. It would kill many ships and far more illusions. For Yamamoto, the outcome on this small island would validate his earliest warnings in a way he had never desired. War against an industrial giant cannot be won by style or audacity alone. It must be won by a sustainable system that converts ore and oil into ships faster than submarines can sink them, that trains pilots faster than attrition can erase them, that feeds garrisons not just with honor, but with calories. At Guadalcanal, the Empire was compelled to fight a kind of war it had not prepared for, one in which the decisive result arrived not in a single blow, but in a long arithmetic. As August turned toward September, both sides had time to think in fragments. The Marines considered the ridges they held, and the ravines they did not understand yet. The Japanese considered whether to hurl regiments into night assaults that doctrine extolled and logistics starved. American sailors rotated watches and tried to forget the shapes that had burned into their retinas at Savo. Japanese sailors tallied runs down the slot, each one a gamble against moon and radar and luck. Nothing about the campaign was inevitable except this: industrial time favored the side that could keep flying at noon and unloading at dusk. Guadalcanal did not end Japan's offensive spirit. It ended Japan's freedom to choose where spirit would matter. From here onward, the Empire would answer to a schedule it did not set and to a production curve it could not bend. The Marines in their shallow holes did not need a lecture to understand that truth. They could hear it in the sound of engines over the strip each afternoon, and in the silence that followed when the last bomber droned away and the jungle resumed its whisper.
The war's narrative had shifted. At the campaign's start, the Americans came to prevent an airfield from ruling the sea lanes. By the end of the second week, they had created an airfield that began to rule the island and the water around it. Japan still had night, skill, courage, and torpedoes that ran true for improbable distances. America had daylight, factories, fuel, and a runway that grew smoother every day. The contest was not decided, it was defined. Definition is the first step toward destiny. What Yamamoto sought in January, a spectacular blow to force negotiation, had inverted. Midway had subtracted capability. Guadalcanal would subtract will. Hour by hour, convoy by convoy, raid by raid. The octopus that had once stretched across oceans now found its tentacles tangled around a single island, whose very name would become shorthand for exhaustion and endurance. Men on both sides would come to hate the sound of it and measure their lives by it. The sea, which had borne Japan's advance, now bore witnesses to its slowing. The jungle, which hid ambush and terror, also hid a truth the Empire could no longer deny. You can seize ground with audacity, you hold it with logistics.
and logistics in this new war against an industrial democracy was a language Japan could speak only for so long before the sentences trailed off into silence. Guadalcanal was not yet won, but the direction of the war had been set.